She walked barefoot in the heat of the sun with her baby. No one helped her except a lonely rancher.
Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from.
Summer of 1882. The desert east of the Verde River felt like it hadn't known rain in months. The air didn't move. Even the wind had given up. Every inch of ground was baked solid, every rock hot to the touch, every leaf curled in on itself. Heat shimmered above the hills like something broken in the air. Not far off, vultures circled slow over a dry ridge, waiting. Na'ima's body swayed with each step. She was young, maybe 22, though exhaustion had taken the roundness from her face. Her black hair was damp against her scalp. A single feather, once threaded carefully into a leather cord, stuck out limp from the side of her head. Her buckskin dress clung to her body with sweat and dust. Her bare feet were cracked, caked in blood and sand. In her arms, she carried a baby girl, 6 months old and limp with heat. The child's breath was shallow, her eyelids twitching from the sun. Na'ima had wrapped her in a cloth, but it was thin and soaked through. Every few minutes, Na'ima adjusted the fabric, trying to shield her with her own arms. Her heart pounded too hard. Her lips were dry. She hadn't urinated in a day. She'd walked nearly 40 miles. The reason she was walking alone didn't leave her mind. It hadn't for days. Her own people had turned her out. Her husband, Tohani, had died in a raid 2 seasons ago. Since then, his relatives blamed her for every loss that followed. When her baby was born, they said she was cursed. Bad spirits. A sign of weakness. They never said it to her face. Just looked through her. Kept food from her. Moved their tents further away. Then one night, they told her to leave. She'd begged. Not for herself. For the baby. She'd held her up. Cried. But they didn't care. The elders turned their backs. No one stopped them. So Na'ima left. With nothing but her child. Now, as she crested the last hill, her legs shaking beneath her, she saw something that made her chest seize. A house. A real one. Built from wood, patched in places, but standing solid against the hill behind it. A chicken coop. A barn. A narrow corral. A windmill with a slow-turning wheel. And a man. He stood near the corral, still as a fence post, watching her. He didn't move, didn't lift a hand. Just stood there. Na'ima's breath caught. She didn't know what kind of man he was. Some ranchers shot first, others worse. She slowed, her legs nearly buckling under her. But she kept moving. She didn't have a plan. Only one thing in her mind: water, shade, something to give the baby. Just get close enough. The man disappeared toward the porch. Eli Carrick had lived on that ranch 6 years. He was 34, tall, broad through the shoulders from years of hard work. One leg stiff when he walked, the result of a Confederate rifle ball that cut clean through his thigh outside of Murfreesboro. He'd been a soldier once, like his brothers. Only he came back. He didn't speak of the war. He didn't speak of much. Folks in town called him strange, but they didn't say it to his face. He kept to himself. No visitors, no family. He worked the land, fed the stock, repaired what broke, and went into town once a month for supplies. He hadn't spoken to another soul in 3 weeks. But when he saw her walking over the ridge, skin burned, dress hanging in rags, a baby in her arms, he felt something sharp stir in his gut. Not pity, not fear, just the certainty that if he didn't do something right then, that woman and her child were going to die in front of his house. He went inside. Na'ima saw him return a minute later with something in his hands. She didn't slow. Her vision tunneled. She reached the front gate, trembling. He walked onto the porch and crouched near the steps. Set down a cup of water, a folded blanket, a piece of bread, a damp cloth. Then he stood and sat down in the chair beside the door, hands resting on his knees. Watching. He said nothing. Na'ima hesitated at the gate. She clutched the baby tighter. Her head spun, but there was no one else. The house wasn't a trap. It was shelter. And the man, he hadn't come closer, hadn't asked her name, hadn't touched his gun. She opened the gate, walked forward. The heat beat on her neck. Her feet sank in the dirt. Each step took effort. The porch loomed. She reached it and lowered herself slowly to the steps. The cup of water shook in her hand as she lifted it. She sipped, just a few drops, then held it to the baby's lips. The child stirred, suckled weakly. Eli watched her without expression. He hadn't decided yet what to do. He wasn't a man to act on impulse. But this was an impulse. It was something else. Something old. He thought of his brothers, dead before 30. Of the grave he dug on his first day on this land. Of the silence that filled his house every evening. She hadn't asked for help. She hadn't begged. That mattered. Naima didn't speak. She ate a corner of the bread, then wiped the baby's face with the cloth, folded the blanket over both of them, and leaned back against the porch post. Her body was at the edge, muscles twitching, her arms locked around her child. She kept her eyes on the man, but she didn't leave. When the sun finally sank behind the ridge, the desert cooled. Chickens settled. The windmill squeaked softly in the dark. Eli stood, walked inside, and closed the door. Naima stayed. She didn't sleep easy, but she slept. And that night, for the first time in many months, the house wasn't entirely empty. Dawn slipped over the ridge, gray and silent. The kind of dawn that felt cooler than it was only because the night had burned the heat off every rock. And Naima woke when the first rooster crowed behind the barn, her back pressed to the porch boards, the blanket stiff with dust. The baby stirred, whimpering, and she checked the child's skin with 2 fingers. Warm but not burning, mouth tacky, eyes half open and unfocused. Then she listened for footsteps inside the house, unsure whether the man would appear or whether she and her child would be ordered to move on. Eli Carrick was already outside, 100 feet off, hauling water from the well to the horse trough. His limp pronounced this early but steady. He worked in silence, only the slosh of the bucket and the rhythmic click of the windmill blades cutting the stillness. Now, and then he glanced toward the porch, not long enough to intrude, just enough to be certain she was still breathing. Naima watched him, tall, beard trimmed with a knife, not a barber, shoulders hunched slightly, as if ready for recoil. She wondered what kind of soldier he had been, what made a man leave the war, yet keep a rifle hanging just inside his door, and whether that rifle would ever swing her way. She tightened the blanket across her chest and lifted the baby higher, deciding that if he meant to harm them, he could have done it in the dark. Still, caution sat at her bones. Eli set the bucket down, wiped one forearm across his brow, and walked to the porch without hurry. He stopped 2 steps away, placed a dented tin bowl and a wooden spoon on the floorboards beside her, steam rising from thick oat porridge, and next to it a half-pint jar of cool well water sealed with a scrap of cloth. "For the little one," he said, voice low and unused. Then, after a pause long enough to feel like choice, he added, "My name's Eli." She nodded once. The word caught in her throat, then managed, "Naima." He waited a moment more, like a man testing brittle timber, before dropping a folded feed sack blanket at her feet and returning to the yard. The porridge smelled like cinnamon. She fed the baby first, dipping her finger and letting the child taste, then spooning slow until the small mouth moved on its own. The baby drank for the cloth strainer, cheeks sinking and color returned by degrees. Watching, Naima felt something loosen behind her ribs, relief mixed with doubt, and she wondered whether relief was safe to feel. Eli spent the next hour mending a corral rail splintered by a restless mare, swinging a hammer in steady arcs. Naima's gaze followed the rhythm. She guessed he wanted her to see the work because work was the only language he trusted. When he finished, he limped back and pointed to the side door of the house. "Shades cooler," he said. She hesitated, then rose, every muscle protesting, and carried the baby inside. The room smelled of cured pine and soap. A single table, 2 chairs, a wood-burning stove gone cold, shelves lined with jars of beans and dried peaches. On the far wall, a door stood open to a narrow storeroom. Inside, a hay-stuffed mattress lay on crates, a clean quilt folded at its foot, and a tin basin beside a jug of fresh water. Eli's voice came from behind her. "Best I can do." She nodded again, a whisper of thanks she wasn't sure reached him. While the baby slept, she washed her own face in the basin, the first real water on her skin in 2 days, and she caught her reflection in the water's surface. Cheeks hollow, eyes red-rimmed, but still alive. She thought of her husband, Tohani, shot through the chest when rivals raided the camp, and of how his brothers said her grief made the spirits restless, that the child brought misfortune, and how the elders' silence meant agreement. She closed her eyes, remembering the night she was told to go, the moon white on abandoned cooking fires, and clenched her jaw until it passed. Near noon, Eli returned carrying a small tin of white powder and a folded cotton square. "Fever," he said quietly, pointing to the baby's forehead. "Crushed willow bark. Mix it with water, dab her skin." It was more words than he'd spoken all morning, and she noted the way he avoided her eyes as he offered the remedy, as if eye contact risked a promise. He leaned on the doorway post. "You got somewhere else you aim to be?" Naima shook her head. "Nowhere." "All right," Eli said, scratching his beard. "You can stay a spell. House is your same as mine. Long as you're here, you don't owe me thanks. Just mind the gates and keep the hens from the kitchen porch." The last words almost brushed humor, rough but present. That afternoon, she followed him into the yard, baby bundled on her back, and without being asked, gathered eggs while he checked the irrigation ditch that carried a trickle from the spring. She moved slow but sure, proving with each task that she wasn't fragile, and he noted it, storing the observation the way a carpenter measures a board before cutting. When a cow bawled from the far end of the pasture, Naima glanced at him, reading the concern in his posture, and without thinking asked, "Need help?" Her English was hoarse but clear. Eli paused, surprised she spoke first, then nodded toward the saddle shed. They spent an hour doctoring a stone bruise in the cow's hoof, two sets of hands working without friction, and something unspoken settled between them. That survival here would be shared or not at all. Night came with a cooler breeze. Eli lit a lantern and sat on the porch rail. Before heading inside, he spoke toward the dark yard where she was rocking the baby. "If you plan on naming her, do it soon. Children ought to have names." Naima looked at the small face in her arms, thinking how her tribe refused to speak the child's first cry, and whispered in a language Eli didn't know. Choosing a name meant for new beginnings. Inside, Eli checked the rifle above his bed out of habit, yet felt less weight in the routine, because for the first time in years the silence in his home was shared, and the emptiness had borders. He lay awake wondering why the sight of a woman and her infant stumbling out of the heat had pierced through 6 seasons of chosen solitude, and decided it was because they kept walking when any reasonable soul would have quit. That kind of stubborn he understood. Across the narrow hall, Naima watched her daughter breathe, the fever easing, and fought the urge to gather their few belongings and run before dawn, because trust was dangerous. But more dangerous still was walking back into a desert that didn't care if she lived or died. She closed her eyes and told herself she would leave when the child was strong. Yet part of her already knew she would not, because the man with the stiff leg had placed a mattress in his storeroom and called the house theirs the same as his, and sometimes staying was the only form of rescue left. Outside, the windmill turned slow in the moonlight, the squeak of its blades a steady heartbeat over the quiet ranch. And 2 people who had barely spoken more than a dozen words now shared the same roof, each one aware that the decisions made in the next few days, whether to stay, whether to trust, whether to help, would decide if this place became a refuge or just another spot on the map where someone passed through and kept going. By the 3rd day, the baby's fever had broken. Her cheeks weren't as flushed, and her breathing steadied. She drank water on her own and made soft noises as she stirred in Naima's arms. It wasn't a full recovery, but it was enough to ease the pressure in Naima's chest. She checked the baby's skin for rashes, held her close when she slept, and kept a careful watch for any sign the illness might return. Her instinct told her it wouldn't. The worst had passed. Outside, Eli worked the east fence line where a section had given way. Naima stood under the shade of the porch roof, baby wrapped to her chest, watching him drive nails into sun-dried posts. He didn't ask for help, and she didn't offer, but he didn't look surprised when she came down the steps and joined him. She held the fence upright while he hammered. Neither of them said a word. The silence between them had grown less heavy, less uncertain. It wasn't comfort, not yet, but it wasn't distance either. It was how 2 people lived when they both had to be quiet for too long. There were no questions, not about what had happened before or what would come next. He hadn't asked about her tribe. She hadn't asked why he lived out here alone, miles from anyone. But questions were there. The truth was, Eli had spent years deciding not to need anyone. The ranch wasn't much, but it was his. After the war, after burying his younger brother outside Atlanta and the older one near Knoxville, he hadn't had the stomach to go home. Tennessee was full of memories and not one person who made it feel worth returning to. He'd headed west, taken a land claim near the Verde, and built what he could. It wasn't peace, but it was silence. And that had been enough. Until now. Now, there was a woman on his land, a mother with a baby, and every hour she stayed, the house started to feel different. It wasn't just the sound of another person moving through it. It was the way the place had begun to function again. Water fetched, eggs gathered, a pile of laundry washed and hung without discussion. The days had rhythm again. Naima had never lived inside a house before. Not like this. She'd slept in lodges, woven shelters, temporary camps. There had been order, yes, but it was different. And she noticed things here. How Eli folded the dish towel over the stove handle every morning. How he kept his boots in the same spot by the door. How he walked the fence line twice a day without fail. These were habits of someone who built a world where no one else could interfere. She didn't want to disturb that, but she didn't want to be invisible either. That evening, after supper, just beans and corn mash, Naima took the baby outside to cool off in the breeze. She stood by the coop, watching the chickens move in clusters, pecking the earth. Eli was leaning against the porch post, pipe unlit in his hand, the way he sometimes did when he was thinking too hard. "Your wife," Naima said, her voice flat but clear. "She dead." He looked at her. The question didn't come from curiosity. It came from necessity. If she was to remain here, she needed to know what space she had stepped into. "No wife," he answered. "Never was." She nodded, looked away. He watched her for a moment, then added, "You married?" "I was," she said. "He died." He didn't ask how, and she didn't explain. That was enough. Later that night, Naima sat inside beside the sleeping baby. The small storeroom Eli had cleared for her now held a foldable blanket, 2 jars of dry grain, and a small basket she'd made from straw pulled near the creek. She had started collecting things. Not much, but enough to notice. And she caught herself wondering what that meant. She'd said she would leave once the baby was strong again. That had been the plan. But now the baby was better, strong enough to travel. Yet she hadn't packed, hadn't asked for directions or mentioned the trail. She told herself it was because the child needed one more day, maybe 2. But in truth, she didn't know where she would go. Her tribe had made it clear there was no return. Not even to her grandmother's fire, not even to the mountain valley where she'd grown up. That door was closed, permanently. And there was something else. Eli hadn't asked her to leave. In fact, he'd started doing small things that made it harder to imagine leaving. That morning he'd fixed the latch on the storeroom door, not saying why, just tested it twice before walking off. The day before, he'd set a small pail by the porch for washing, the kind used for laundry, not stock. She noticed everything. The next morning came fast, hot before sunrise. Eli had a wagon yoke pulled out near the barn. He was oiling the iron clamps when she came to stand beside him, baby slung at her back. "Can I help?" she asked. He looked up, wiped sweat from his brow with the edge of his sleeve. "Sure," he said. "Grip this side." She did, without hesitation. For the next hour they worked in tandem, silent, efficient, natural. No fumbling. When the work was done, he leaned against the stall rail and looked at her. "You plan on staying through the week?" "I don't know," she said. "Plenty of work if you do." He tapped the yoke. "You're good at it." She didn't answer, but she didn't leave either. That night, while she lay beside her daughter, she heard him moving around outside the house, nailing something to the gatepost. She didn't get up to check. Not then. But the next morning, as the sun lit the yard and she stepped outside with the baby still against her chest, she saw it. Fresh carved letters in the post beside his own name, small and clean. Naima. He hadn't said a word, and she didn't ask him why. But when she saw it, she stood still a long time, one hand tightening around the baby's back, the other tracing the rough edge of the wood. Not as a guest, not as someone passing through, not as a burden. It was the first thing in a long time that made her feel like a person again, like someone who had a place. Eli didn't come out right away. Maybe he didn't want to be there when she saw it. Or maybe he just didn't know what to say. But later that day, when they passed in the kitchen, both carrying buckets, she looked him full in the face for the first time and gave the smallest nod. It wasn't thanks. It wasn't permission. It was something else entirely. Something that said, "I saw what you did, and I stayed." The fourth week on the ranch began with a dry wind from the south and a sky the color of ash. Dust rolled in thin sheets across the pasture, and Eli knew by the feel of it that the weather was turning. He adjusted the latch on the barn door, drove the nails in deeper. Monsoon rains wouldn't hit for weeks yet, but this wind carried the kind of heat that made wood crack and tempers shorten. He moved slower that morning, his legs stiff from the shift in pressure. Inside, Naima was boiling water. She had taken over the stove without being asked. It was a small change, but Eli noticed it. Not just that she knew how to work the heat properly, adjust the firewood, regulate the boil, but that she did it without hesitation, like she'd always known how to live inside a space not her own. She moved with quiet certainty, sleeves rolled up, hair tied back with the same strip of worn cloth. The baby, now stronger, more alert, sat in a basket beside the table, watching both adults with wide eyes. Eli had noticed the girl more too, not just as a weight on Naima's back or a reason for her to stay, but as a person. A small one, sure, but one who tracked movement, smiled when the wind shifted through the window, reached out for the chickens when they passed too close. That morning, Naima turned to Eli as he walked through the doorway and said, "Her name is Aylin." He stopped, looked at her. She hadn't named the child aloud before. "Aylin," he repeated. Naima nodded. "It means clear path." He didn't ask what language it came from. He figured if she wanted to tell him, she would. But he tried the name again in his head as he hung his hat on the hook. Aylin. It fit. The kind of name that stayed quiet but solid. They ate together, still mostly in silence, but it was no longer the silence of strangers. Eli caught himself watching the way Naima used her left hand to hold the bowl, her right to spoon food to the child. How efficient she was, how natural. She never asked for help, but if he offered it, she never refused either. After breakfast, they cleaned up. Then Eli went to the far field to check the water pump, and Naima took Aylin and followed the chickens around the side yard, picking up loose feathers, flipping over boards where snakes sometimes hid. She moved with confidence now, as if the land remembered her. Later, under the shade of the porch, she began sewing a wrap from an old feed sack and some cotton thread she'd found. Aylin slept across her thighs. The quiet rhythm of her needlework filled the space between them when Eli came back from the field. "You ever plan to go back?" he asked. She didn't look up right away. The needle paused just once. "There's nothing to go back to." Eli nodded. "I figured." He sat on the edge of the porch, arms resting on his knees. The distance between them was maybe 3 feet. "Not far. My family's gone," he said after a long pause. "My brothers, both of them didn't make it home." Naima looked at him now. "What about your parents?" Eli shook his head. "Father drank himself to death before the war. Mother died of fever when I was 16. After that, it was just me and the boys." He didn't know why he was telling her this. He hadn't said that aloud in over a decade. Naima didn't offer sympathy. She just listened. "You," he asked. "My mother died, giving birth to my youngest brother. He lived a year. Then he died too. What about your father?" Her jaw shifted slightly. "He's the one who told me to leave." Eli didn't say anything for a moment. Then, without turning his head, he said he was wrong. Naima didn't answer, but her hand slowed its sewing. That night, after Aylin had been put to sleep and the house was dark, but for the lantern on the porch, Naima stepped outside and found Eli sitting alone. She stood beside him without asking and watched the stars overhead. So many they seemed to pulse. The wind had softened. "I was told I couldn't have children," she said quietly. "The elder women said something was broken in me. That's why they blamed her birth. They said I'd cursed her father." Eli looked over. "But you did have one." "Yes," Naima said, "and I didn't die. You shouldn't have been alone out there with a child." "I would have kept walking until I fell," she said, voice steady. I told myself every hill would be the last. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. What made you stop here? Naima glanced at the yard, where the windmill creaked lazily in the dark. The way you didn't speak. Eli looked at her, confused. You didn't ask what happened. You didn't ask who I was. You just left water and bread. That told me more than anything else could. Eli sat back. His chest was tight, and he didn't understand why. I didn't know if you were dangerous, she said. But I thought, if a man says nothing, maybe he's too tired to lie. That was the closest thing to a confession either of them had made. The lantern burned low. After a long stretch of silence, Naima turned to go inside. But before she reached the door, she paused, then stepped back toward him. She leaned down, not fast, not tentative, steady, and kissed him. It wasn't long. It wasn't romantic. It was a decision. Then she walked inside and closed the door. Eli sat there, hands still on his knees, staring out into the dark. The windmill creaked once, and that was the first night in 6 years he didn't sleep alone, not just in a house, but in his mind. The morning after the kiss, the sun rose the same, casting long gold lines across the dry earth, but the air in the house felt different. Not tense, not uncomfortable, just aware. A quiet shift, like the sound of a wagon while creaking slightly off-center. Eli woke early as usual, washed his face with cold water from the basin, and moved through the kitchen with the same rhythm. But when he set down 2 coffee cups instead of 1, he paused for a second, then carried on like it was habit. Naima hadn't spoken of the kiss. She hadn't explained it or stepped back from it. She came into the kitchen just after sunrise, carrying Aylin in one arm, her shawl wrapped tight against the morning chill. She looked rested, focused. Her eyes met Eli's without hesitation. That was answer enough. They didn't speak much that morning. Eli handed her the coffee. She nodded once. Aylin was chewing on a piece of hard bread Naima had softened with warm milk. The child cooed, stronger every day now, her fingers curious about everything she could reach. The silence was no longer a wall between them. It was a room they both stood in comfortably. Still, questions hovered. There were things that hadn't been said, things that lingered just beneath the surface. Eli stepped out to tend to the animals. Naima followed later with a basket to collect eggs. She moved through the yard like she belonged to it. Not as a guest, not even as a helper, just present. The way someone is when they've quietly taken root. After chores, Eli cleaned his rifle. It was a routine, like sweeping or shaving, something he did once a week without fail. But this time, Naima sat nearby, Aylin asleep beside her, and watched closely. You still expecting trouble? She asked. Eli looked up, wiping the oilcloth along the barrel. Always best to be ready. Out here. He nodded. Sometimes riders pass through. Drifters, bounty hunters, worse. Not often. But when they come, they don't ask first. Naima folded her arms. Your neighbors? Closest is a day's ride. We trade feed sometimes. That's it. Folks around here don't visit much. She seemed to weigh this. If they ask about me, they won't. And if they do, I'll handle it. It wasn't a promise made out of chivalry. It was simple, practical. Eli didn't like questions, and he didn't know anyone answers. Naima nodded once, slowly. She hadn't known if she could count on him to say that out loud. Now she did. Later that day, she began sweeping the storeroom again, pulling dust out from under the crates and wiping down the windows. The door creaked, and she glanced over to see Eli standing there. You can move into the main room, he said. If you want. She straightened. That your way of asking? It's your house, too, he said, the words plain, heavy with intent. I figure you should sleep where it's warmer. There was no need to question what he meant. She nodded once, not smiling, but not cold either. That night, she moved her things quietly. Aylin's basket was set near the corner of the main room, close enough that either of them could reach her if she stirred. The bed was wide enough for 2. They lay side by side in silence, not touching. But it was understood, this wasn't charity. This was choice. 2 days later, a group of riders passed near the ridge. Eli spotted the dust trail just before noon, 3 figures on horseback slowing near the fence line. He tensed immediately, reached for the rifle inside the door. and stepped out to the porch. Naima saw him from the coop, picked Aylin up without a word, and backed into the house. The riders didn't cross the boundary. They sat on their horses, talking low. Eli stood still, rifle down, but ready, watching. After a long minute, the men turned and rode off, heading northwest toward the mining roads. That night, Eli cleaned his rifle again. Naima said nothing, but when she brought him a cup of coffee, her hand brushed his as she passed it. The gesture was small, but it carried weight. Later, they sat together on the porch. The windmill squeaked in the dark. Crickets clicked from the brush. Naima said, "I used to think the baby would keep me from being free." Eli looked over. "But now I think she's the reason I keep going." He didn't answer right away, then said, "Sometimes it takes something breaking to figure out what you really need." Naima was quiet for a while. Then she asked, "Did you ever want children?" He nodded slowly. "Used to. Never had the chance." "You still do." He turned to face her. "I think I want what I've already got." The look she gave him then was full. No smile, just clear, steady understanding. She reached for his hand, held it lightly between hers, and they stayed that way a long while, neither moving, neither pulling away. By the next morning, something unspoken had shifted. When Eli came in from the pasture, Naima was already boiling water and cutting potatoes. Aylin was babbling near the fire, and Eli stood by the door watching them both like he hadn't really seen them until now. Naima glanced at him, a question in her expression. "What?" she said. Eli shook his head once. "Nothing. Just looks right." And for the first time since she'd arrived, Naima smiled. Not out of politeness, not from relief, just something simple and true. She stayed close that night, no walls between them. When they lay down in the dark, she rested her head against his chest, and he folded his arm around her without hesitation. The silence was no longer needed. They'd earned the quiet that followed. And outside, under a sky thick with stars, the house didn't feel like a shelter anymore. It felt like a home. It had been nearly 6 weeks since Naima first stepped onto Eli Carrick's land. The days had begun to blend, not in monotony, but in rhythm, one chore to the next, one quiet evening into the following morning. The yard had changed. The garden bed near the chicken coop was cleared and ready for planting. A line of laundry ran between the house and barn. Inside, the room once used for storage now held shelves Naima had scrubbed clean and stacked with folded cloth, baskets, and baby linens. That morning, she woke before Eli. Aylin was still asleep in her basket. The air inside the house was warm, but still, the kind that pressed down before a coming storm. She moved gently, barefoot, stepping outside with a tin basin to catch water. The sun wasn't up yet. Pale gray hung over the land. She stood on the porch and looked out across the field, listening. A quiet moment she claimed for herself. Eli found her out there not long after, his shirt unbuttoned to the top, boots unlaced. He carried 2 cups of coffee, offered one without speaking. She took it, fingers brushing his. They drank in silence, and when he sat beside her, he didn't touch her, but she leaned her shoulder against his. The conversation came later, after breakfast. He stood by the table, glancing toward the window. "I'll need to ride to town in a couple days. Supplies. Maybe sell some feed." Naima looked up. "You go alone?" "Usually." He hesitated. "You and the baby could come if you want. Or stay." She didn't answer right away. "Then, if I go, people will stare." "They will." He didn't soften it. "But no one will touch you while I'm near." She watched him a long second. "Then we'll go." The decision was simple, but what it meant wasn't. It would be the first time she'd shown herself in a town since exile. First time presenting Aylin to the world beyond Eli's fences. She didn't say any of that. She just nodded and began gathering what they'd need. The next day, they packed before dawn. Naima wrapped Aylin in a heavier cloth and carried a satchel of dried food, spare baby rags, and her own knife, small but sharp. Eli saddled the wagon horse and tied down the feed sacks. They rode with Naima seated beside him and Aylin in her arms. The town was 3 hours west. They arrived mid-morning. Cotton Ridge wasn't large. A few streets. General store, feed mill, post office, saloon. Men loitered outside the barber shop, eyes narrowing as the wagon pulled up. A few women crossed the street, whispering. Naima felt every glance. Eli kept his eyes forward, jaw tight. He helped her down without speaking, waited as she adjusted the cloth around Aylin, then handed her the satchel. "You don't have to come in." "I will," she said. Her voice didn't shake. Inside the store, it went quiet. The owner, a round man with bad knees named Tupper, blinked once and looked toward Eli. "Well now," he said slowly. "You're early this month. Need more grain," Eli said. "Also coffee. Soap. Sugar if you got it." Tupper nodded, eyes flicking to Naima and Aylin. He didn't speak to them, but he didn't say anything cruel either. That was enough. Naima moved through the aisles while Eli spoke with the clerk. She noted how many people stared but said nothing. When she reached for a spool of thread, a woman near the front stiffened and stepped away. Naima didn't react. She'd known worse than this. Her grip tightened on Aylin, who was now alert, watching the shelves with wide, curious eyes. Outside, things were more tense. 3 men stood by the water trough, watching. One of them, a tall man in a black vest with sleeves rolled high, tipped his hat as they passed. "She yours?" he asked, voice flat. Eli didn't stop. "She's with me." "Didn't ask that," the man replied. Eli paused. "You aiming to make it your business?" The silence stretched. The man looked Eli up and down, then looked at Naima longer than he should have. Aylin made a soft whimper. Naima shifted her weight. "Looks like you brought home charity," the man said. Eli didn't move at first. Then he stepped forward once, squared his shoulders. "You want to say that again?" The man smirked, but his smirk faded when Eli took another step. His limp made him slow, but there was no hesitation in the way he stood. His hand hovered near his hip, and everyone knew what that meant. "I said nothing," the man muttered, stepping back. They left town without further incident. On the ride back, Naima didn't speak. Not until they were halfway home, the dust lawn behind them. "You didn't have to do that," she said quietly. "I did," Eli answered. "It's my name they'll remember, not yours." Naima looked down at Aylin, then at the empty stretch of road ahead. "That's the first time I've ever had someone stand in front of me." Eli didn't look over. "You won't be alone again." When they returned, the sky had darkened. Thunder rolled in from the south. Rain started that evening, heavy and slow, the kind that soaked into the cracks and clung to every beam of the porch. Eli sat near the door, drying his rifle with a cloth. Naima sat cross-legged by the hearth, Aylin asleep in her arms. The baby's breath was steady, deep. Eli spoke quietly. "What you said before, that people would stare. They will. Maybe they always will." Naima looked at him. "I know. You still want to stay here? Even with that?" She nodded. "Yes." He stood across the room, sat beside her. His hand rested on her back. "I've got more than I came out here with," he said. "I like to keep it." Naima looked at him a long moment. Then, "Keep us." The lightning lit the room for a second. Aylin shifted but didn't wake. Eli leaned forward and kissed Naima's forehead. She closed her eyes, and when he pulled her in, she didn't resist. They sat there until the rain let up and the fire burned low. That night, in the quiet warmth of the house, they lay together without distance. It wasn't hurried. It wasn't dramatic. It was steady, unforced, and certain. No words passed between them. But every touch said the same thing. You're not a guest. You're home. The rain lasted through the night and into the next morning, a steady, soaking kind that the land hadn't seen in months. By dawn, the dirt paths around the barn had turned soft, and the usually brittle mesquite leaves looked green again, as if the ranch had exhaled for the first time in a while. Eli stepped outside with his boots already damp. He looked across the field where puddles had formed under the fence line. The roof had held, thanks to the patchwork he'd done in spring. He turned to glance over his shoulder. Naima was on the porch, barefoot, Aylin resting on her hip, wrapped in dry cloth. They hadn't spoken much since the night before, but they didn't need to. There was nothing left to explain. Eli reached for her hand as he passed. She let him take it. Inside, the house smelled of fresh wood smoke and warm beans. Naima had started a pot early, cooking from instinct more than habit. Aylin had already eaten, her face sticky with mashed beans and milk. The baby babbled softly now, growing more expressive by the day, tracking sounds and movement with alert, deep-set eyes. Her presence filled the house. After breakfast, Naima walked out with Eli to check the chickens. The coop had held up through the storm, though one board had come loose. They fixed it together. Her sleeves were rolled. Her feet were muddy. She moved like someone who knew what she was doing, and Eli caught himself watching her more than the job. It wasn't the way she looked. It was the way she worked, decisive, unafraid, as if every nail driven, every bucket hauled was a way of planning her place in the world again. By midday, the rain thinned into a mist. Eli went out to split firewood, while Naima took Aylin inside for a nap. When he returned, he found her sitting near the hearth, carving thin strips of fabric into cord. She had found a way to repurpose nearly everything in the house. Sacks into storage, jars into lantern holders, scraps into thread. He hadn't asked her to do any of it. She just had. That afternoon, while Aylin slept, Eli cleared his throat across the table. "I've been thinking," he said, quiet. Naima looked up, waiting. "I could go to town next week and speak to the magistrate. It wouldn't take much. Not out here. Just a name on a paper. Would make things official. If you wanted it to be." Naima blinked once. She understood what he meant, and she didn't respond right away. He filled the silence. "You wouldn't have to. I know you didn't come here for that." She looked toward Aylin's basket, then back at him. "What would it change?" "Not much," he said honestly. "House would still stand. We'd still get up, feed the stock, raise the child. But you wouldn't have to worry about folks asking questions. Not if your name matched mine." Naima's voice was calm. "I don't care what they ask." "I do," Eli said. She looked at him again, harder this time, like she was trying to gauge how deep his words went. "I'm not afraid of raising her alone," she said. "I already was. You won't have to anymore." There was no rush in his voice, no pressure, but it was real, steady. He wasn't offering rescue. He was offering permanence. Naima stood, crossed the room slowly. She sat beside him, not across, looked into his face. "Then take me to the magistrate." He exhaled like he'd been holding it without knowing. A long quiet passed between them. Then Naima said, almost offhand, "And after that, you should build a bigger cradle." Eli smiled for the first time in days, just barely, but enough. That night, the three of them shared a meal by the fire. Aylin lay between them, kicking her legs and grabbing Eli's finger like it belonged to her. He let her hold it. Later, after the baby had fallen asleep, Naima and Eli lay side by side under the same blanket. No distance, no hesitation. Their movements were slow, wordless, sure. Eli traced the shape of her jaw with the side of his hand. She undid the buttons of his shirt one by one. When she pulled him closer, he followed. And when she whispered his name, just once, he answered not with words, but with care. It wasn't urgent. It wasn't desperate. It was what came after the walls had fallen, after silence had done its work, after trust had taken root. They moved together in the quiet, like people who had learned how to stay, like people who had chosen each other, not because they needed to, but because they wanted to. When it was over, she rested her head on his chest and let her hand rest low across his ribs. "You're not going anywhere," she said. "Neither are you," he replied. And outside, the last of the storm clouds drifted west, the sky clearing over the land they'd come to share. Not as strangers, not as survivors, but as something steadier than either had ever dared to name. The paperwork didn't take long. 2 days after the rain cleared, Eli rode into Cotton Ridge alone, clean-shaven for the first time in months, boots polished, collar tucked. He returned by dusk with a small folded sheet from the magistrate's office and a quiet look on his face. He handed it to Naima without ceremony. She unfolded it slowly, eyes scanning the handwritten lines. It was brief, just a statement of union, a name change, a record of residency. Her name now officially matched his. No ring, no vows, no audience, just ink and intent. She folded the paper and tucked it in the bottom drawer of the kitchen chest, under Aylin's spare cloths and a bar of soap. It was where she kept the few things that couldn't be replaced. That night, the baby slept soundly in her cradle, which Eli had already begun reshaping with more space and thicker joints. The house, once sparse and cold, now carried the scent of boiled corn, clean linen, saddle oil, and something warm, something that lingered even after the fire burned low. But in the morning, a new worry arrived. Eli spotted it first, tracks near the property line. Fresh. 3 horses, 1 wagon, turning off the main road where no one ever turned. He followed the prints with a tightening gut. The wheel ruts were heavy, sunk deep, someone hauling something big or staying longer than just a pass-through. He returned to the house, quiet but alert. Naima met him on the porch. "What is it? Company maybe? Trouble? Don't know yet." He didn't mention the tire tracks to alarm her, but she didn't need warning. She picked up on the shift in his posture, the way his hand kept hovering near his side, even though there was no rifle in reach. The next morning, they saw them. 3 men in dust-covered clothes rode up, slow, toward the edge of the pasture. A 4th man sat on the wagon seat, holding the reins. Behind him, under a tarp, crates stacked high. Eli stepped out first. He didn't call out, just stood by the fence, arms loose but ready. The baby was inside, sleeping. Naima stood in the doorway with her shawl pulled tight around her shoulders. She didn't look away. The men stopped about 30 yards out. The lead rider was heavy-set, mid-40s, mustache slick with grease. His shirt strained against his gut, and his eyes were mean even at a distance. "Afternoon," he called. Eli didn't answer. The man tried again. "Heard this place was empty." "It's not," Eli said. "Didn't look like much from the road," the rider said. "Thought we'd water our horses. Might camp a night or 2. Eli shook his head once. "Not here." The rider smirked. "You own this whole ridge?" Eli's voice didn't rise. "You're not camping here." A long pause. The man leaned on his saddle horn. "We don't mean trouble." "Then don't start it." The rider snorted, nudged his horse forward a few steps. "Look, we're hauling freight for a trader out of Winslow. Lost a wheel yesterday. Just need a place to rest till we fix it. We'll pay." Eli didn't budge. "No charge." "But not here." The man looked at the other riders. One of them, younger, at the house. When he saw Naima, his gaze lingered too long. Her arms folded slowly, jaw tightening. Eli caught the look. "You should move on before you wear out your welcome." The lead rider's grin slipped. His hand dropped closer to his side. But Eli was already shifting his weight, boot planted firm. The message was clear. Finally, the man spat in the dirt. "Suit yourself." They turned slowly, kicking dust as they headed east, wagon creaking behind them. No shots fired, no threats made. But Eli didn't relax until they were well beyond the ridge and out of sight. That night, Eli cleaned the rifle again. Not from use, just routine. Naima boiled water while Aylin chewed on a strip of cloth near the hearth. "They'll be back," she asked. "Maybe, maybe not." She looked at him. "You weren't scared." He glanced up. "I was." Didn't show. He laid the rifle down, rubbed his thumb across the stock. "There's a lot I don't show." Naima sat beside him. Her voice dropped low. "They looked at me like I didn't belong here." "You do. But out there, they won't see that." "They don't need to," he said. "I do." She leaned into him. "You're not afraid of fighting." "I'm afraid of losing what I got," he said. "That's different." She rested her head against his shoulder, and they stayed that way a long while. No words, just firelight and the sound of Aylin's soft breath in the dark. Before bed, Eli checked the locks twice. Then he took a blanket and hung it over the back window, just in case. Outside, the wind had picked up. The chickens were quiet. The land, which had felt steady all these weeks, now felt like it was holding its breath. But inside the house, there was no fear, just readiness. And in the stillness, as Naima pulled the baby against her chest and Eli lay down beside them, something else settled in, a certainty. That they wouldn't run, that this place was worth holding, that what they'd built, even if small, was real. She turned to him as the lantern dimmed. "If I ever get pregnant again," she said quietly. Eli opened his eyes. "You think you are?" "I don't know yet," she said. "But I'm not afraid of it anymore." He reached for her hand under the blanket. "If it happens, we'll raise that one here too. Same as Aylin. Together." Naima's voice was calm. "No tribe. No exile. Just us." He squeezed her hand once. "That's all we need." And with that, the wind shifted west, clouds moved off the ridge, and the house on the edge of the desert held firm in the dark, quiet, guarded but alive. By the time spring arrived, the air over the ridge had softened. The ground, once hard and cracked beneath Eli's boots, now held water in it, enough to grow. Saplings pushed up near the pasture fence. The garden Naima had cleared was planted now, small green shoots poking through soil she turned by hand. Eli added a row of flat stones to the path between the barn and the porch without speaking a word about it. Naima noticed anyway. The men with the wagon never came back. No strangers passed the ridge again that month or the next. Eli hadn't let his guard down completely. He still checked the far fields before sundown, still cleaned a rifle every Sunday. But something deeper had settled between him and Naima, a kind of peace that didn't rely on luck or silence, but on choice. Intent. It was the first season in years he hadn't lived waiting for something to go wrong. Aylin had learned to sit up on her own. She'd taken to crawling straight toward anything shiny or warm. Naima's hair, Eli's boot buckle, the firewood pile. When Eli scooped her up by the waist, she giggled loud enough to fill the room. He'd started calling her Bug under his breath, and Naima never corrected him. One afternoon, while Naima washed clothes near the trough and Aylin kicked her feet in the water, Eli walked up behind them and cleared his throat. When Naima turned, he was holding a small wooden object, flat, carved smooth, with rounded edges. She raised an eyebrow. "What's that?" Eli crouched and held it out. "Nameplate. For the cradle. Thought it ought to be hers now." Naima took it in her hand. He'd carved the letters deep. Aylin, and below it, the date of her first day on the ranch. Not the day she was born. The day they arrived. "It's her home," he said. "Same as ours." Naima didn't speak right away. She looked at him, then the child, then the ground. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet but clear. "I'm late," she said. "A few weeks now." Eli stood slowly. "You think?" She nodded once. "I'm sure." His face didn't change much at first. Just a small exhale. His jaw shifted slightly. Then he rubbed the back of his neck and looked out toward the field, blinking once, like he needed a second to understand the size of what she'd just said. He turned back to her. "You feel all right?" "I do." He nodded. "Then we'll get ready. I'll clear the spare room. Make a second cradle." Naima smiled softly. "You planning ahead already?" "I've got work to do." "You'll need rest." She stepped closer. "Eli," he met her eyes. "We don't need anything fancy. Just you. This place. The quiet. That's all." He reached for her hand. "Then that's what we'll keep." That evening, they walked the fence together. Naima carried Aylin against her back, and Eli worked slow, hammering a loose board where the cattle had rubbed it down. When they reached the far edge of the pasture, the sun was already dipping low, setting the sky in quiet reds and orange. They stopped there, leaned against the fence rail, and looked out across the land they'd come to claim. Not with money or deed, but with work, with staying. Eli looked over at her. "You ever think about leaving again?" Naima shook her head. "No one left to run to, and everything I needed was here waiting." He gave a slow nod. "I used to think the war took everything from me. Now I think it gave me the space to start over." She looked down at her belly, then over at Aylin, who had fallen asleep with her cheek against Naima's back. "We built something real," she said, "with nothing but our hands." Eli looked at her a long moment. "And we'll raise them strong. Both of them." She stepped forward, leaned her head into his shoulder. "Married. Settled. Children. You think we're soft now?" Eli chuckled once. "No, I think we're finally not broken." They stood like that until the light faded. That night, they didn't light a lantern. The fire alone warmed the house. Naima sat cross-legged on the rug, Aylin asleep beside her, Eli behind her, rubbing her shoulders with hands calloused from years of labor. The silence wasn't empty. It was full. Before bed, he laid a hand gently on her belly, then another on her back. "We'll be ready," he said. Naima turned, took his hand in both of hers, and pressed it over her heart. "I already am." By morning, they had begun clearing out the side room. They didn't speak of the future in grand terms. No plans for schooling, no names picked, no dreams of fortune. They just built what needed building, fed what needed feeding. stayed when it would have been easier to leave. And when the sky opened wide and the sun burned down again over the ridge, no one passed by. No one questioned their right to be there. The ranch belonged to them now. So did the life they'd made. And for once, nothing needed saving anymore. Nothing needed running from. It was done, and it was good.